today let's talk about a few game mechanics in Warhammer 40k that have the potential to flip a close win into a loss or vice versa, and a few thoughts on some things that could lead to some feel bad wins in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today I just thought I'd share a few thoughts on a trio of things that might on occasion lead to some wins in game that didn't necessarily feel super deserved. I'd be interested if any of these have actually flipped games for you in real life and meant that you've won when you otherwise would have lost, or the other way around, and how you feel about the mechanics. The first one's perhaps a slightly historical one in Warhammer 40k, not a part of the main game at the moment, but it certainly was a thing for several editions in the past. Seize the Initiative was a role that I'm honestly not too disappointed that they did away with in the time. It did go through a few iterations, but I do remember that around about part of 8th edition, it really felt like something that could turn a game on its head just with one unlucky dice roll. For at least a good chunk of 8th edition, the system was that rather than alternate in units when you're deploying, you alternated in armies. One side got to deploy all of their units first, which was kind of a disadvantage, as then the second player got to deploy all their units and could kind of perfectly counter-deploy the first army. Then though, as part of the compensation for having to drop first, the player who put down their forces first would get to go first, so it meant that they'd at least get one movement, shooting and fight phase before the opponent did. So potentially you could have units hide or move up to inflict the first damage against anything that they could reach. In 8th edition, the go first advantage was a fair bit bigger than in 9th and 10th. Terrain and cover tended to be a lot more patchy, though Games Workshop do seem to have done quite well with it in more recent times, in that going first and second don't tend to confer enormous advantages, at least on tables where you've got the right amount of terrain. Seize the Initiative, though, was something that I thought just really unbalanced this entire thing in 1 out of every 6 games. The idea behind this was that the player who deployed second would get a small chance to flip the game on its head. If you can roll a dice and get a 6, then they got the first turn as well, which basically had meant that they'd been able to perfectly counter-deploy the opponent's army, and then also got the first turn as well, theoretically being in the position to deal quite a lot of damage to their opponent's units, given that the first player would usually have set up kind of aggressively, as that makes sense if you're going first 5/6 of the time. It just meant that for 1 in every 6 games, the game did feel like it started on a kind of horrendously unbalanced note. 2 major advantages to one player before you've even started. If the game was kind of close before, then it probably wouldn't have been after this. Perhaps the main issue was the small chance of it actually happening. A 1 out of 6 chance wasn't really enough incentive for the player deploying first to deploy more cautiously. You're better off just embracing the fact that you're going first 5 out of 6 games and try and do really well in those ones. I must admit I was kind of glad when they did away with this. I certainly remember a couple of games that I played that I just got very lucky and seized the initiative myself. I just felt plain unfair, turning a close game into something that was really not. I'd be interested to hear if that experience matches any of you guys out there. And for those of you who do remember Seize the Initiative, is there anyone who'd want to see it return in some fashion? I guess in 10th edition it's just not really all that relevant though, given that it's just completely random who takes first turn, and with a random dice roll no player has agency in swaying it at all. Even if they win the roll off and don't want to go first, they don't have any choice about it. Another one that I've always felt was curious since they introduced it was the whole idea of paint for points and the whole battle ready thing that Warhammer 40k has. In more recent Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop have generally had a system where you get an extra plus 10 victory points out of the 100 available if your army is battle ready, and you can only score 90 points if you haven't done this. This one really seems to be one that is very differently played in different local groups or different gaming settings. I've heard loads of people who have basically never really said that they've ever used this and wouldn't expect people to use it against them. And on the other hand, plenty of people who say that they do frequently use this, given that it's an 100% rules legitimate part of the game. It absolutely is part of the Warhammer 40k core rules for better or worse. If your entire army isn't painted up to battle ready standards, in theory you should be missing out on those victory points and your opponent should be getting them if they have. And I would say that in general it is a motivation factor to help encourage painted armies on the tabletop. Maybe not everyone enforces this, but at least some people out there might be kind of swayed by the fact that people might have it just as one extra motivation to get some paint on those minis. Obviously I've got nothing against people painting miniatures. It is genuinely great to see people have painted models duking it out on the tabletop. For the majority of time it's not likely to be close enough to flip a game from a win to a loss. The majority of games of Warhammer 40k don't tend to end within 10 points differential of each other. And even if they do, the person who's receiving the extra points might not even have been the losing player to start with. I do think it is super weird though whenever a close game gets flipped by a win to a loss purely from painting. I find the overlap between modelling and actual gameplay rules to be kind of jarring. Generally I see the tactics on the tabletop as separate to how you've assembled and painted your army, even if in general I do tend to play with fully painted and based miniatures myself. I feel like it'd just feel a bit cheap in a way if you've had two armies duking it out and going toe-to-toe each other really quite effectively. You've had a super close game and one player has just come out on top on the scoring game, but then the other player called them out on their painting, maybe they've not got one unit entirely finished yet. Would just feel like a bit of an odd reason to flip the game from a win to a loss, at least on paper, and it wouldn't really feel like much of a win in my opinion. I must admit it isn't something that I'd ever enforce against an opponent with an unpainted army. Even if I have played against people who've been absolutely adamant that they're not getting the extra 10 points if they turn up with an unpainted miniature or two, people do like to be polite. It maybe feels particularly strange if the opposing player's got a very nicely painted army and then they just haven't got round to completing one unit yet that they've put on the board. Feels like it could be a rule that does punish people who paint a bit slower and like to take their time and get their miniatures painted right, and potentially not very helpful for newer players who are likely to have more unfinished miniatures on the board than experienced ones. Though I feel like the majority of players in that situation wouldn't try to be too punitive on new players who are clearly learning the ropes. I don't think it's even particularly relevant for tournaments either, given that tournament games tend to have minimum painting standards just built into their entire rule set to start with, never mind any game-to-game type things. So in theory their battle-ready bonuses shouldn't be changing any games at all. Let me know what you think of this one though. Is battle-ready something that you enforce in games or have had enforced against you? And what's your thinking of the mix between 40k gameplay and painting rules? Finally, and for a more recent example from 10th edition, I feel like the Gambits might fall into this kind of category. In general, I do think that the mechanic is kind of interesting and well designed. It's the 10th edition catch-up mechanic, and seems to have been thought about by someone in the rules team who realised that 40k can have an issue with games being kind of decided fairly early on. It's not always the case, but certainly in a lot of games that I've played, by the end of turn 3 it's pretty clear who the victor's going to be, and the last few turns can be kind of going through the motions just to consolidate their victory. Gambits aren't something that I've seen people make great use of in 40k, most of the time because they can be just a little bit fiddly and are often just a bad idea outright. The idea is that at the end of battle round 3, if a player realises they can't catch up by normal means and they're mathematically outscored, means that they could try a gambit, meaning that you bin off your primary mission and instead just go all out towards one extra bonus objective, and then at the end of the game you'll have a low chance at getting a big 30-point payoff or nothing at all, so basically going all or nothing. And even in the very best scenarios where you've got loads of units all over the board to try and achieve the gambit, you're still going to be odds on to fail it, even if you're a player that was doing very well and was winning quite hard. I feel like some people do find these kind of interesting and do use them time to time when their army's on the back foot, though other players just don't really make any attention to them whatsoever. They are usually going to be a bad idea, having a very low chance at the payoff, when you might be able to just about make yourself have a few more primary points if you do something clever. They do have the goal of making you have something big and interesting to do, even if the actual gameplay payoff is a very, very small chance at something big. For Gambits, I feel like the best design is achieved though when people go for a Gambit, give it their best shot as a fun little side mission to keep them amused at the end of the game, but then the roll for the Gambit doesn't succeed, as it's always odds on not to. When you do manage to get lucky and the Gambit actually pays off, even if the chance was low, I feel like it could just be a pretty weird feeling if your opponent had very clearly outplayed you and he didn't really have much chance at the game, then you risk it all on one slightly silly punt, and then manage to walk away as the victor, with blind luck being the biggest factor in that. I guess there's nothing enormously wrong with there being a little bit of randomness, particularly when the chance of it actually happening is kind of low, and every so often when it does come off and matters big, it's going to be a bit of a wow, what just happened sort of moment. But again, it does feel maybe just a little bit like reverse seize the initiative in its own way. A really low chance of giving one player just an absolutely enormous swing that they couldn't have achieved otherwise, with the main determining thing perhaps being luck, say for the orbital strike coordinates one. Again though, let me know how you've been finding Gambits in 10th edition. Do you like or dislike the mechanic, and have they changed any games from wins to losses? As mentioned with all of these, I do look forward to hearing your thoughts on them down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new 40k videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main thing that allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly, with new ones out just about every day. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.